30 seconds to kick on YouTube, but yeah.
Okay. Let's wait until it hits 12 your time, right?
Yep, it should be.
I have it open on one
Okay,
of my
we're good to go.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
still waiting for it to start. It's just I
Yeah.
have it open, so I'll be able to let you. There we go.
We're good.
Great. Hello everyone again. Hello everyone. My name is Adele, International Programs Coordinator at iDebate Rwanda. So to give a background of iDebate Rwanda is an NGO that aims at improving critical thinking and public speaking in high school and university students so that they can become active citizens in their communities. So we started the program that's called the iDebate Exchange. So this program helps us introduce our students to virtual events and international events so that they can be open to that world as well. So today we're here with University of Nebraska Lincoln for a panel discussion on the following topic. So the topic of today says, this house believes that the United Nations should have a standing international army for peacekeeping missions. And today on the panel, we have Christian Bahire, Bertrand Dishimo for iDebate Rwanda, and we have Connor Wallen and Caleb Alexander for University of Nebraska Lincoln. So I'll go ahead and give a representative from the University of Nebraska Lincoln to give a small introduction, and then we can dive into the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adelpha. I'm the director of debate here at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. My name is Dr. Justin Kirk, and I'm here today with Caleb Alexander and Connor Whalen, two of our sophomores from our competitive debate team. And one of the things that we really love about the iDebate Rwanda program and engaging in this global debate series is the opportunity to connect with people over a activity that has kind of universal appeal to students around the globe, teaching the skills of pedagogy and critical thinking and argumentation and research, and in-depth analysis of global issues that are pressing in the world today. And so as a public-facing event, we really try to encourage our debaters and our squad to reach out to other programs and other groups to try and make debate a much more kind of impactful experience for everyone. This is the second year we've done an online debate activity with iDebate Rwanda, and in many ways, this is one of our favorite events to do throughout the year. We plan for months to think about these debates so we can engage in a helpful and productive discussion. And hopefully today, you will get to hear some really excellent discussion and arguments about whether or not the United Nations should have a standing army as its peacekeeping force. So without further ado, I will let iDebate Rwanda take the first speech and hand it over to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. So the discussion is starting with the first speech from iDebate Rwanda, and we'll have Bertrand Dishimo going first. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to connect through this discussion of whether the United Nations should have a standing international army for peacekeeping missions. So this army will be used to maintain and secure peace in regions that have been devastated by conflicts and warfare zones. So I wanted to start by a simple illustration of why the United Nations should have a peacekeeping force. You know that the way that the system of the world is built up, in each country, we have the Ministry of Health that is there to make sure the health of the population is sustained. But at the end, we have the Doctors Without Borders and we have the World Health Organization. So even if the local Ministry of Health in each country is concerned, we also need an international body to harmonize everything. That's why we have Doctors Without Borders, and that's why we have the World Health Organization. In each country also, we do have the Ministry of Education, which is there to oversee the education purpose of the institutions, curriculum development, and everything. But at the end of the day, the United Nations and the world systems realize that it is not enough for the local institutions to govern that. And that is how the United Nations in charge of children education fund, UNICEF, was created. So we have the Minister of Education in each country, but we do also have the UNICEF. Same to our finance systems. Each country has a national bank, but at the end of the day, we have the World Bank. Each country has the Ministry of Economic and Finance, but at the end, we have the International Monetary Fund, which is the IMF. So it shows that even if we do have local institutions that are governing systems and running policies and implementing agencies in each country, we also need to have a global system that will harmonize all of those actions. And that global system will act as a moderator, as a mediator between the local institutions and the international community. So from these examples, we are going to illustrate that the UN should have a standing international army for peacekeeping missions. First of all, we need a regular standing body because the Article 51 of the UN Charter states this: nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. So this is the UN Charter itself in the Article 51, which stipulates that an army is needed, a force is needed, even if now it's not standing, but a force is always needed to maintain peace and security. So the UN should have a peacekeeping mission always standing there, because an army is there to be standing and to be ready, to be standby for any conflict that might arise in the area. So there's an army that is ready, that is trained, instead of having meetings and voting in the UN Security Council and calling on countries to form nations. So a standing force is needed. Second, the second reason is whenever there's a war, a third party is needed to stand in the middle. A third party is needed to stand between the two teams fighting and maintaining peace, at the same time pushing for negotiations, which, if doesn't happen, affects the population at last. So in most of the countries, we have wars that are making armed rebel groups go against the state. And when the conflict happens, the people who are suffering the most are the population. So to solve that, because the army is attacking the people, the local population, thinking it is hosting the militia, it is hosting the rebels. And to solve that, the state will push against their own agenda, and the army will also push against their own agenda. So that's why a third party is needed in the middle to make sure negotiations are being pushed. That is being discussed in Sudan, it is happening in DRC, and many other parts of the world. So we have example of the attacks that took place between Israel and Palestine in the recent times. I'm very sure that if a standing force was there to neutralize the two parties, to make sure they engage in negotiations, it would have helped far better than the situations we have now, where more than 15,000 of people have lost their lives. The third one, the whole world believes that the international community is a trusted partner that should judge between any conflict that is between two societies. And this, to be clear on this, we know that whenever there is we know we have MONUSCO in the DRC, we have MINUSCA in Central Africa. We have many other peacekeeping missions, but which are not there and are not standing. And most of the times they're coming from their different countries. But when this standing force will be established to be there standing forever, it won't be representing any interests of any state. It will be an army trained by the UN, created by the UN, governed by the UN, not governed by any single interest of the country. So, and in that way, it brings me to my third point, which shows the international community is a trusted partner to stand in the middle ground and make sure the state believes in the UN, and the population and the rebels as well believe in the UN. And all the negotiations that take place during conflicts, they are solved by the UN. So the UN is very better suited to make sure it's solving the problem, because it's the UN, it's governed by different countries, and hence it can be trusted. I also want to tackle one point of I think some people some people do support the use of bilateral relations between countries to fight conflicts. But we've had an example in Ethiopia. We saw when the Tigrayan TPLF, Tigray's People Liberation Front, was against the state. The Ethiopian state had MOUs with Eritrea to fight the rebel groups. But what did this result into? People were massacred, rapes, sex was used as a weapon of war. Why? Because the two countries are working together. They're against a rebel group that is hiding in certain forms of population, Tigrayans in this case, and it made the Tigrayan population suffer. They were bombarded, women were raped, girls were raped, and it created a lot of conflict. And this could not happen when it is the peacekeeping mission that is standing in the middle. So I wanted to do refutes that claim that many people keep pushing of having bilateral relations between two countries in their defense attaches, pushing to fight the rebels. It has resulted into very bad examples, and that each one of us should fight. So ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the time is now, and the UN standing peacekeeping mission is needed more than ever to solve conflicts and solve warfares in our regions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Bertrand. Now we'll have a speaker from the University of Nebraska Lincoln.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, everyone. Okay, thank you. So I'm Connor Whalen. I am representing the University of Nebraska Lincoln today. Okay, and if everyone's ready, I'll begin the first speech. Starting now. The mission of the United Nations is to facilitate international peace, security, and cooperation. Specifically, the United Nations defines three core principles that underlie any peacekeeping operations it executes, excuse me. First is consent of the parties. All parties present in a conflict need to mutually agree that it would be beneficial for the UN to deploy a peacekeeping force in the area before operations can begin. This is especially important because if not everyone in a conflict trying to benefit from a resolution of it agrees it would be beneficial, that could potentially derail any mediation efforts. Second is impartiality. The peacekeeping force must be impartial in how they work with the different parties affected by the conflict. This is distinct from being neutral in execution of their mandate. Essentially, what this means is that the UN needs to enter with an open mind and just try to make an agreement regardless of political agenda or beliefs or other disagreements they may have with one or more sides of the conflict. Third is non-use of force. While peacekeeping operations can use force at the tactical level, it's not meant as a tool for enforcement or policing. Force is only to be used in situations requiring self-defense. The Libyan civil war is an excellent example as to how long-term peacekeeping operations currently fail. During the Arab Spring, involvement quickly forwent peacekeeping in favor of overthrowing the Gaddafi regime. The atrocities of the Gaddafi regime are not lost on us. However, the results of these peacekeeping missions produce long-term harm for the goals and credibility of the United Nations more broadly. One example of how this is manifested is by the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, leading Russia and China to veto every subsequent proposed peacekeeping operation for fear that such operations are co-opted in the name of propagating a political agenda instead of fostering cooperation, disarmament, and de-escalation of the conflicts that they affect. As such, we negate the proposition. It is not in the best interest of the international community for the United Nations to have a permanent standing peacekeeping force. For the purposes of this discussion, we define standing as remaining in force or permanent. Presently, the UN requires mutual consent from both parties in order for a peacekeeping force to be deployed. The implementation of a proposition opens up a Pandora's box of consequences that undermines peacekeeping operation. We have two scenarios as to how carrying out the proposition is detrimental to the UN peacekeeping force's ability to carry out its objectives. First, the establishment of a permanent force will make the UN more likely to jump the gun. In complex situations such as Libya, Yugoslavia, Ethiopia, or Somalia, with large amounts of actors and different parties vying for power, or that could incentivize strategists to pick and choose winners before getting in boots on the ground, actually involved in trying to de-escalate the conflict. This complicates the peacekeeping mission because it directly contradicts the fundamental principle of impartiality that guides the peacekeeping force. Second is non-use of force except in cases of self-defense. The reason that a temporary force exists is so that it can't be co-opted by members of the Security Council in order to enforce their political agendas. This ties in with the point we made about intervention in the Libyan civil war earlier. We've seen how a long-term operation, not just a permanent one, has already scared other members of the Security Council. So we believe that carrying out the proposition would compound that problem even further. Allowing for the UN to become its own distinct separate military entity, it opens the door for whoever's on the Security Council to get a new vehicle to impose their political will. Well, this doesn't mean that a material shift in how peacekeeping operations are conducted or the motivations for them are conducted happens. But what also matters here is perception. How are these peacekeeping operations perceived? Because if they have less credibility coming in, then it's going to be harder to de-escalate a conflict and get their foot in the door to find a peaceful resolution. This has three implications. First, absent the proposition's arguments of effectiveness, we believe that a permanent peacekeeping force produces inherent contradictions within the UN's peacekeeping mission that substantially harms their credibility. This makes it impossible for a permanent peacekeeping force to solve conflicts. Maintaining credibility and a sense of impartiality is critical to fostering such an environment, especially as a peacekeeping mission has just begun. You're less likely to cooperate with someone if you don't think that they have your best interests in mind due to impartiality. Second is that a permanent peacekeeping force would interfere with state sovereignty. If other regional parties are interested in sending a peacekeeping force, such as the African Union, UN forces would be interfering in regional desires. This undermines the ability for many of these regions to self-govern in the long term, because regional interests will have a better idea of what the conditions are in that area and how to de-escalate a conflict so that it doesn't happen again. Having a permanent standing peacekeeping force would lead to that being ignored more and more as time goes on. And third, this leads to a phenomenon that we call mission creep. Carrying out the proposition turns peacekeeping into policing, which then escalates into regime change. And we have two excellent examples as to how peacekeeping has worked in the status quo as a temporary force. First is Namibia. UN peacekeeping was critical in de-escalation of the South African border war. The following nation-building efforts spearheaded by the UN's peacekeeping forces were critical in the establishment of both a Namibian constitution and other government institutions, paving the way for free and fair elections, which have continued to this day, almost 35 years later. Second is Liberia. During the 15 years that the UN mission in Liberia was active, thousands upon thousands of soldiers were peacefully disarmed and demobilized. This helped facilitate three consecutive peaceful transitions of power, more than the country had seen in several decades. In addition, the operation was integral to rebuilding many of Liberia's social institutions, including public health care, the police force, and poverty alleviation. We agree that the peacekeeping force as it is isn't perfect, but it's getting the job done as is. We've seen this with Namibia and Liberia. Making it permanent and long-term isn't the best course of action here for allowing it to be a de-escalator. We firmly believe that carrying out the proposition will severely harm peacekeeping operations credibility, both right now and in the future, and produce material harms. We cannot allow the UN to be its own separate military entity. Making sure we still have checks and balances of having to muster a temporary force, making sure that temporary force is approved. That's what's important, not just having it on retainer. We agree that a peacekeeping force is necessary. Just that in this debate, it is an issue of whether or not it should be permanent, and we argue that it shouldn't be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll have now Christian from iDebate Rwanda.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And thank you to the University of Nebraska for this opportunity to have this debate with you. It's such a pleasure and honor, as well as thanks to iDebate Rwanda for giving us this opportunity to share ideas with you. As they have said, first of all, what's the issue exactly in terms of having a standard force? They were saying this will cause more problems, and they were saying actually they don't need basically temporary forces, and they were saying actually at the end of the day, this also becomes a problem in terms of state sovereignty. But again, also let's look in terms of those states that really need those forces, those states to whom these forces can be very important to. Do they have at least the opportunity or plan B to get them? So, in a world where conflicts persist, where the shadows of the past genocide and atrocities lingers, and where the every sense of human security is at stake, we believe that some of the things we should change and be innovative in terms of how we do stuff. For example, one of the first arguments we have is the urgent need for rapid response, which this has been shown around and around by many countries requesting for extension of the troops that were there. For example, let's start with the genocide against Tutsi in 1994. By then, General Lomeo Dalai requested for more troops, to come and help out with the situation that we had in Rwanda. But at the end of the day, for the fact that there were no army that were ready to come and help out, this ended up actually by them reducing the number of the troops that were here in Rwanda, which again results into 100 days of a genocide whereby more than 1 million people were killed. So now the question becomes, we going by the status quo where we're going, whereby UN has no permanent forces, no standard forces, whereby even those troops that are somewhere doing the peacekeeping, when they have a problem, when they need other troops to come in and help them out, but they can't find anyone. Is that what we need to move forward with? Or we may look for a solution whereby we can change things for things to be better. This doesn't only happen in Rwanda. The case can actually keep on going. You have Rwanda, you have Bosnia, as well as Darfur. So again, we have seen that the more we don't have a lot of army that are actually in place to help in terms of when things are needed is a problem. For example, we believe when you have standard army forces that are there for the UN to help out, this will reduce the burden on individual nations, whereby when UN needs to send troops somewhere, all the nations, they come together and then be able to look for who can help out to send their own forces to come as the UN forces to help in a certain country. But guess what? At the end of the day, due to some countries' interest at heart, due to some political gains and many more things that can be allowed, some of the places end up not getting forces to help them out. Not because the need was, not because they don't have need, or not because they don't really have a problem, but because some of the political involvement that were around. Well, I believe that if the UN has a standard forces, those countries, those places, again, at the end of the day, will be able to get forces and armies to come help them out. The bureaucracy and the time that it took for decision to be made and the process again will be reduced. So, again, on the next point again, we believe that there will be a lot of economic benefit and stability. A lot of economic benefit and stabilities. For example, UN peacekeeping forces, where they have seen them staying in the long places, but again, nothing's being solved. For example, we can go with the Congo, DRC. Not only there, but again, we believe that UN peacekeeping forces so far, the temporary ones, have had a reputation on themselves that where they are, rather than solving a lot, but they end up also causing some of the problems. whereby now the country that were only dealing with conflicts, wars, now it's dealing with the conflict, wars, plus now rapes that are done by those who are supposed to protect them. What does this bring on the table? This actually reduced the economic benefits and the global stability, but we believe when there is this permanent forces, standard forces by the UN on a central soil, this will actually give a lot of faith to international donors or maybe people that can come invest, because they believe now there is a force that is there not temporary, but is there permanently to solve a central problem. And then even if other forces need help, there'll be another force that is ready to come and help them out. Not only that, some of the nations don't send their armies out because they believe at the end of the day, when they meet with the problem, there won't be any other nations that will go out to help them out. But if, for example, Rwanda sent its soldiers to the UN to do a central peacekeeping mission, at the end of the day, they have faith because if they need more people, more armies to join, they knew that UN, we have another troop reserves on the other side to come and help out. So, as we conclude, we believe that the topic of today is not just a programmatic response to challenges of our times. It is a moral imperative. It is a commitment to learn from the mistakes of our past, to adapting to the evolving of nature of conflicts. Actually addressing the root cause of the problem is what we should be doing. So, by doing this, we are building a world where a rapid, effective, and coordinated response to crisis are not aspirations, but realities. We envision a future where global stability, not only through ideas as intangible achievement, where economic prosperity is entrusted with peace, and where United Nations stands as a coupon of hope for humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. Now we'll have the second speech from UNL.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caleb Alexander. Currently debating for UNL. First off, I'd like to start this off by thanking iDebate Rwanda and everyone on your guys' team and our team as well for creating this amazing opportunity for us to have this discussion together. It really is such an honor, especially for us college students. Moving on to the topic of this discussion. First off, I would like to reiterate the guiding principles of the United Nations peacekeeping mission. First is to establish consent of the parties. This is an important concept that we can get into later, and this is where a sort of standing army that has a place permanently could violate. Number two is impartiality, right? Establishing credibility within the UN peacekeeping force requires a commitment to not taking sides in any sort of conflict or pushing for any sort of agenda. Third is the non-use of force, not taking any sort of offensive actions that could be perceived as a slight against one party or another in difficult conflicts where there are multiple parties vying for control. First, by establishing a sort of standing army, what it does is it opens up a Pandora's box to others' issues. First is that by placing the military as a central point of resolving conflicts, it pushes military solutions to the front of the debates about a lot of these international conflicts, and it puts it sort of pits military strategic winning as a priority in these conflicts, not so much sort of taking sides or whatnot. And the last thing we need is the military dominating politics or for generals to be deciding policies or choosing winners and losers in conflicts. Second is that the United Nations Security Council this really puts us into a double bind, because first, either A, the United Nations Security Council and the members who control this army are going to see it as some sort of potential power grab. Now, we're not saying any particular party will. However, the last thing we need to do is establish an extension of an institution that could potentially be ruled by another hegemon, regardless of whatever that country is. Or possibly the United Nations Security Council will have problems with a permanent standing army, and some certain members on that can veto the military and its operations. This puts any potential standing army into a situation. Either A, it's going to be controlled by a hegemon that's going to impart their own will, which violates the second guiding principle, Or B, it's going to get vetoed by a member every single time any sort of member on the UNSC sees it as a violation of impartiality, or they don't agree with the purpose of the standing army, which means that either A, it's completely ineffective, or B, it's going to be overly effective. And the last thing we need is the military to be centralized in that. This leads to three separate implications. First is that this violating of this impartiality rule decks any sort of credibility that a standing army could generate for the United Nations. Because of that, which decks their ability to operate in a global sense. Secondly, is that it interferes with the self-governance of other areas, right? When we let generals and whatnot control a large standing army in any situation, it puts military at the forefront of things. Now, these local governing bodies are no longer the ones with the power and control. Instead, most of the influence is held within generals who are controlling the United Nations Army. And third, short-term peacekeeping gets drawn into a commitment trap that elongates whatever mission that's drawn out. For example, when we look at countries around the world, the United Nations peacekeeping missions typically have a non-offensive role. That's the third guiding principle of not taking any sort of role, of just not engaging in any sort of offensive operation. Sorry. And then the problem with that is when we institute a standing army and we give them permission to extend those things, something that could quickly turn short-term and limited, which would already be inherent to a temporary army, is now turned into a much more real possibility that could violate the guiding principles of the United Nations by making it permanent. Now, another thing to keep in mind is, and this is where we would defend some sort of the status quo, is that first off, temporary situations work. My partner here brought up two separate examples, one in Namibia and two in Liberia, of situations where a temporary peacekeeping force can still be seen as effective. And when we say a temporary peacekeeping force, we don't necessarily mean putting a time limit on their operations within the country. We're just saying that the army itself is temporary and it'll eventually be dissolved. That's key to both Namibia and Liberia, where de-escalation of certain borders and allowing for the local governing bodies to establish development programs is key. And by eventually removing the temporary body, we're actually seen as more credible, not less. Finally, to address some of the key arguments made by the other side, I just want to say that we both have a commitment to preventing violence and a commitment to ending conflict in certain areas. First is that but to address some of the things that they talked about, they say that we need to avoid bureaucracy of building an army, and we need something that's more rapid. And while we agree that we need a rapid deployment of certain forces, it's much better to commit to a reform of the current system rather than to a permanent standing body. And the reason we say that is because with speed, while speed is nice, it could also lead to problems in quick thinking and militarized thinking. We don't want the military to be the first and foremost solution, and we don't want to violate the consent of any of the parties involved. Secondly, they talk about how a third party is key to establishing negotiations and avoiding any sort of team mentality in these conflict hot zones. While we agree that's important, we would argue that a temporary force is much more capable of doing that. Specifically, when we look at Namibia and being able to de-escalate the South African border and otherwise, a temporary force is going to be much better in that sense, because the UN Army will be a trusted mediator, because it won't be ruled by generals or whatnot that could take advantage of the situation, and it's not going to be controlled by certain members of the UNSC Council. The final thing, and we just want to make some takeaways real quick. So first is that a temporary making the UN Army, peacekeeping army, temporary is an important concession in both the United Nations and international politics. When you make it permanent, what you're doing is you open up the possibility for it to be ruled by a certain party, and you open up to the sort of partisan politics on the international stage. That decks any credibility. So while yes, temporary might have its problems, it's still much better than establishing a perfect making a perfect thing. And at the end of the day, we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And finally, and another thing too, is that we need to keep in mind the three guiding principles are more likely to be violated in a world where a standing army dominates UN peacekeeping versus otherwise. At the end of the day, establishing a temporary army is much less likely to do it. And you can look at the status quo in that sense. And finally, a standing army will always be stuck in a double bind that we talked about before that renders it functionally ineffective. either A, it leads to a power grab in the UNSC and it gets involved in the partisan politics that violates the impartiality of the United Nations guiding principles, or B, it's material ineffective because members of the United Nations Security Council see it as a violation of impartiality, and China, Russia, or other countries, or the United States might veto operations that would otherwise make the standing army effective. So in that sense, it's much more better to engage, use the temporary question as an important concession to generate consent and the ability to work together. Not to mention, and finally, a temporary force is still working, albeit not perfect. Reforms are being implemented now already within the United Nations. Currently, about 48 different reforms are being pushed through. Again, while it's not perfect, at the end of the day, we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And a temporary peacekeeping army is much less likely to violate the guiding principles and much more likely to help countries reestablish themselves post-conflict. Thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much. So for now, we're open for a dialogue between speakers. So if you have any question for the other team, you are free to write them down or say your question and then they shall answer you. So if iDebate anyone has a question or UNL anyone has a question, you're free to ask your partners. Thank you.
When doing the research for this event, what was the most interesting thing that you guys happened to?
Okay, thank you. So anyway, so most of the interesting thing that we found through the research is actually the time that it takes for decisions to be made to send army force to a certain country. And then you find that is happening, the request is happening at the same time when the problems are happening. And you find that at the end of the day that even troops are sent, you find at least more lives that should have been saved, some of it will actually dying in the process. And then that again becomes a problem of the status quo, how the UN is running things. Is it actually a very good way or it really needs to be changed? So basically that's one of the things that was very surprising. And the fact that it's there and then it's visible, everybody can see it, and nothing much is being done to that. That was very, very surprising. Maybe I can add something to that.
So my interest was basically how I was able to look through different examples and realize that whenever the conflict is between two people, another person is needed to stand in the middle. So I was interested in looking at how the same scenarios applied to different countries, different cultures, different corners of the world. But again, it resulted into the same thing, and which indicated that the solution has to be the same, because you can't explain to me how different societies, different cultures, people from different backgrounds, different corners of the world face the same issue. So the solution has possibly to be the same. Thank you.
Okay, but also question that goes to you guys as well. Basically, you talked about the 3 principles that should be guided, no matter what kind of decision that UN should take, which is actually agreement. The country should agree on the same, and then impartiality, and then as well as there is no use of extensive forces. But don't you think sometimes at the end of the day, it's necessary that for example, those countries that are actually agreeing that they need the permanent forces to be there, and also that sometimes at the end of the day, you see that people's lives are at stake, and then also some defensive mechanisms should be in place, such as maybe in Rwanda what happened, which was some of the troops were killed here on the soil. By the end of the day, what happened was they reduced the troop rather than increasing more to come and help people out. Don't you think at the end of the day, if all these three you stated, I will actually agreed on, do you think by then will it be okay actually for the permanent forces to be there? But also in case permanent forces not replacing the temporary ones, but actually them to be there in case they're needed, right? Also, you can react on that one. Thank you.
We agree that having consent between all the parties is what makes peacekeeping possible in the first place. How we view a permanent peacekeeping force as opposed to a temporary one on being worse for that is that if these are the same troops that de-escalate a situation in one country where or something might have happened politically that would affect their opinion in the other country, at that point, it can become a bit muddled as to who, say, party A doesn't want them in country B right now. Oh, is that a thing? They don't think that they'd be helpful, or is it a political or ideological thing? Was how I envisioned it when I was doing research into the principles, if that answers your question.
I was gonna add a little bit onto that too. You know, I like I said in my speech before, I think both teams really do agree to this sort of commitment to preventing violence and saving innocent lives. That's the foremost priority. And I think, you know, when we talk about like this consent and these like impartiality and guiding principles, to, you know, every situation is going to be contextual, right? Not every situation is going to be the same. And to some extent, we would argue that, you know, violating some level of this, right? I mean, there are examples where the UN did violate some guiding principles to save lives, to things. And so, and in that sense, we would argue that, you know, well, at least we argue that a temporary body is much better for that, because while yes, it is important to save lives and perhaps like guiding principle is important, you know, the ability, if we violate the guiding principles too extensively, then in the future that, you know, really takes away our, at least from our perspective and our research, is that takes away, you know, our credibility in other countries wanting to invite us into other conflicts, and our the UN other countries when the UN approving the deployment of forces, which in the long run would probably cost more lives. And so it really is a very delicate balancing act that's very contextual. So yeah, so we understand your perspective for sure, but we would say that it just depends on the situation for sure.
If there isn't any other questions between the speakers, I had a question that I wanted to ask all of the speakers. We can have an answer from each side. And my question is, give me a second, I wrote it down somewhere. My question is, could a standing international army also play a role in preventing conflicts before they escalate, or would its primary function be reactive to ongoing crisis? Does it make sense? All right, thank you. We'll have a speaker from iDebate first and then UNL second.
Thank you. I think that countries are now struggling with their budgets in defense activities. So some are hiring, can I say them, can I call it hiring or recruiting a little number of soldiers. Officers are not being paid well, and defense is such an activity that ensures cost of life, that ensures sacrifice of all of your lifetime. So I'm not sure we would have an army that is preventing violence. And in that case, my question again would be, where will that army be? So will that army be present in all the territories of Earth? Will that army be present in that's in areas with a Cold War or having a spirit of war that is hovering there? So that's another question to wonder. But again, I don't think the UN is able to provide armies to be present in all territories of Earth. So what I think is the UN Security Council would make sure they're always conducting a list of countries in which there are the higher probabilities of undergoing conflicts and wars, and then there should be a standby force that's ready to go there in case something erupts. Thank you.
So, I didn't do much research on the conflict prevention side of it because that was a bit outside of the scope of what we thought the discussion was going to manifest as. But I think that UN intervention in terms of mediation or supporting a dialogue before a conflict starts can be critical in preventing it. But a standing international army could also play a role in preventing conflict. However, I think the main issue with that is the gray area between being there to prevent a conflict and accidentally sparking it because one side thinks that they're going to be attacked in favor of the other, which ties in with the whole credibility and impartiality points that we had earlier, if that answers the question.
I also support that. The conflict prevention part is a very substantial issue in this area, such that, and I think it will then involve a lot of expenses because if now conflicts are going to be prevented, and then after preventing, the war erupts and people still have to fight again. So it's creating a lot of expenses and a lot of logistic purposes, which I think will be invested in something else that will help in preventing the conflict. Because at the end of the day, we will see that the reason as to why of these conflicts and militias and rebel groups are increasing, it is because unemployment is there, people are not occupied, people don't go to school, people don't get enough of their basic rights. So when they don't get these basic rights, that is the source of conflict and that is the source of war. So I think instead of focusing on having military budgets in all territories of Earth and having people starting to fight before and after, instead of investing that money, we'll invest in the socioeconomic part of it. We'll invest in employment, invest in education, invest in having basic human rights. Because if people have these rights, then they won't involve in warfares and aggressions. Thank you.
Okay. Adding to the same question. Okay, adding to the same question from Adele. I think if the standard forces was to be there, I don't think most of it they were supposed to go and to solve the conflicts in the beginning. But I think when the conflict has escalated, like usual thing how it goes, as in if there's an issue with the problems, they actually play the whole resolutions of them being served into Security Council. When Security Council voted for that, now the UN send the troops there. So now when the temporary troops are there, and then the problem becomes too much for them, I think that's when now these permanent forces, they can come in and join in to help out. So I don't think they should come actually from the beginning, but when the problem escalated, become too much, I think that's when they can intervene, which is why we're saying they should not be there to replace the temporary ones, but they should be there actually to help in terms of temporary ones need a quick solutions to the problems that are there, rather than they go through the same bureaucracy, voting, and see the arms to go there, countries giving more forces. I think those that are actually ready, they should be the one to go. If that answers our question, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. We have another question on YouTube that says, since the guiding principles were a key collision in this, couldn't there be a sort of reconsidering of these policies, given the world is currently getting much more war issues? I repeat, since the guiding principles were a key collision in this, couldn't there be a sort of reconsidering of these policies, given the world is currently getting much more war issues? We can have someone from UNL go first and then iDebate.
Thank you. It's me. So the question of like, should we reconsider these UN principles? largely, we would defend, I think, the status quo to a certain extent. Obviously, there are reforms passing right now that are addressing the process and procedures of how the UN forces deployed and operated and controlled. That's important. But many of the guiding principles are fundamental to a lot of things. For example, I think iDebate Rwanda brought up a good point about why, a lot of people are pushed into conflict when their rights are violated and they feel threatened. And so much of the guiding principles are to eventually protecting those rights, right? So for example, like consent of the parties. If you violate, any consent of the parties, you're only taking side in another conflict, and it's seen as a slight against them. Another issue, though, too, is like impartiality is another key point that both sides even agreed on in this point. So, and then, of course, the non-use of force is that third point we talked about, not taking any sort of offensive actions. I mean, these are all guiding principles that are key that we both agree on. And so in that sense, I would say that we don't need to reconsider the principles themselves. We need to consider the policies and procedures of how the army is used and established. Thank you.
And I think it's the reason why we're doing this debate. That's what debate does. Debate informs policies, debate informs changes. So I don't have to say a lot of words, but as the person said from the question, we're just conducting this debate to ensure there's a policy change. We're conducting this to ensure there's a change in the global systems and the way they are run and the way they are administrated. So it's real. On my personal perspective, a change is needed, and that will be implemented through these kinds of debates, through other forms of discussions, through advocacy, and debate is one form of advocacy. So it's true that the UN should reconsider some of its principles, considering this time when we're in a lot of wars and conflicts and aggressions. Thank you.
Adding on to that, as we stated, we can give more examples, and I think the change is really needed. For example, after the Jews genocide, the statement "never again" came on the table, right? Everyone was like, "Never again, never again." But guess what? After that, again, 1994, again, another genocide happened. But again, people are still saying, "Never again, never again." So now the question becomes, if from the Jews genocide up to also 1994, genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, same principles, same everything was still in place. But again, rather than it solving a problem, but again, it brought on the table another problem. And then now we're still saying never again, never again. And then you still have in the world other more places where we say we have a potential genocide. So now the question becomes, if the same principles were in place by then up to now, but rather than solving problems, they're still making problems, I think change is really needed. For example, you're talking about most of the days should not use forces, but we believe people's lives should be every time they priority, because them not using forces, it means people are dying. For example, 100 days, a million people were killed in Rwanda. Rather than UN troops save people, they actually brought the plane with their luggages and their dogs. So the question becomes, at the end of the day, should we really use force when it's needed, or should not use force when they're needed? So I believe change is needed, because problems are there, they're not solved, from Jews genocide up to genocide against the Tutsi, and then other more potential places of genocide I see around. So I'm like, for real, there should be a change, if that answers the question. Thank you.
There is no more, unless there is any other question from the speakers or any other thing you want to
just want to build off this last question briefly. I think that the other three speakers brought up great points. I think fundamentally the principles are fine and form the bedrock of peacekeeping. I think that given that the global tensions are on the rise, that the focus, obviously we need to shift in peacekeeping policy. That's why we're having this debate, and I completely agree on that front. But I think part of the focus should be on laying the groundwork for preventing these. So what our opponents from iDebate Rwanda brought up earlier about building up education, employment, healthcare. That's what prevents conflicts and prevents escalation. It's just making sure that people have food to eat and a roof over their head. But we also need to be prepared to make sure that executing peacekeeping when prevention fails, which it unfortunately does, is also important. We need to shift how we approach the execution, not the fundamental principles that led to the formation of the peacekeeping force to begin with, if that makes any sense.
Great. Thank you so much. If there isn't any other addition or question from our speakers, I think we can go on and go to the end of this discussion, which ends with a small closing remark from the debate director from UNL, and then myself, and then that will be it. But I would like to really thank our speakers today for an amazing debate, and I'll pass to Justin.
Thanks again, everyone, for attending today's debate. Like I said at the beginning, the Global Debate Series and our participation in this with iDebate Rwanda wouldn't be possible without many of our wonderful donors. So I want to take the moment to thank folks like Jerry McGaffey, Bill and Lisa Anderson, the folks who give through kind of their generous personal donations to the program to help us host these events, to maintain a travel schedule, and to provide opportunities for our students to connect with students across the world. You may not realize it because we're all on YouTube in a virtual setting right now, but it's lunchtime here in Nebraska and it's dinner time in Rwanda. It's like 8 o'clock over there, and they graciously are doing this debate well after they should be out of school and out of, the business day. And so we just cannot thank them enough for reaching out to us, helping us to see a kind of perspective of debate that we don't get domestically. The last thing I'll say, and for anyone watching and for anybody who's interested in debate, get involved with debate. Debate can be eye-opening and world-changing. It can provide you perspectives on the world that you have never encountered before. It can engage you with arguments that you don't get to see on a daily basis. And by learning how to advocate for a better change, debate can provide you the voice that you need to make the world a better place. And I think all four of our speakers today are wonderful examples of the transformative and educational power that debate provides. Hopefully, our debate today has both elevated the discussion around this particular topic, but also provided kind of an exemplar of what debate can be on a global stage and how it can promote kind of dialogue across cultural difference, and produce a kind of understanding that, as everyone today in this debate kind of highlighted, the world sorely needs at a moment when conflict is popping up everywhere and violence seems more prevalent than ever. These kinds of cross-cultural communication activities and debates are one of many ways we can work to reduce tension and disagreement in the world. So we just want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and we look forward, hopefully, to seeing you in person in the spring.
Thank you so much, Justin. And I'd also like to thank the University of Nebraska Lincoln for their support, their continued support. They're always one of our hosts during different events that we host here at iDebate, either in person or virtual events. They're always there to support iDebate. And I would really want to thank Justin for always, I was new to this, and he always would make work easy for me. So I am really grateful for your support, your continued support. And I know for sure we're still together in person and have this engaging, amazing discussion together in person. And I also want to thank your debaters. They did such an amazing work, and they all really, they did really good to compare, their new perspective. And I'm really happy that they were open to have this discussion with us. So without any other I would like to say that this is the end, and I want to thank everybody that was watching us live on YouTube for joining, and the questions that were asked. Thank you for the questions. And yeah, I think that's all. Have a great day in Nebraska and